The desert stretched wide and empty. The wind moved softly across the sand, carrying dust, silence, and the scent of exhaustion. Elijah walked alone. His steps were heavy, his cloak torn by the journey, his heart burdened beyond strength. Behind him lay the echoes of triumph and terror alike. Behind him, Mount Carmel, the place where fire had once fallen from heaven. There, before a nation that had turned away from God, Elijah had stood firm. He had called upon the Lord, and the Lord had answered. Fire had consumed the altar. The people had cried, "The Lord, He is God." Oi! And for a moment, faith had been restored. But now, that moment was gone. Jezebel's wrath had followed. Swift, fierce, and merciless. She had sworn to take his life, to silence his voice, to make him a memory erased by fear. And so Elijah ran. Not in pride, not in disobedience, but in exhaustion. The prophet of fire now fled into the wilderness. Not because he doubted God's power, but because he had forgotten, for a moment, God's gentleness. The sun burned above him. The heat pressed upon his shoulders. His mouth was dry, his spirit even drier. He had walked for a day already with no destination, only distance. Each step was an act of weariness. Each breath a quiet confession of despair. The land around him was silent. No birds, no streams, no shade except the few scattered trees that clung to life in the emptiness. The sky above was endless blue. Vast, indifferent, wide. Elijah's thoughts swirled like dust in the wind. What have I done? Oi! Why do I still live? Oi! Has my labor been in vain? Oi! He remembered the faces of the people who had once cheered when fire fell from heaven, and how quickly they had turned away again. He remembered the prophets of Baal who had fallen, and the queen who sought his death. He remembered his courage, and how swiftly it had turned to fear. The wilderness reflected his heart. Dry, empty, silent. He had given everything, and now he had nothing left to give. The prophet who had once called down fire from heaven now sought only shade. The man who had stood fearless before kings now longed to disappear. He came at last to a solitary broom tree. A small, thin shrub, its leaves trembling faintly in the desert breeze. It was no great shelter, no mighty cedar. But it was enough. He sank beneath it, his cloak falling about him like the shadows that gathered at dusk. His hands trembled. His eyes burned with tears. And there, beneath the meager branches, Elijah whispered what so many weary souls have whispered before and since. It is enough. He bowed his head upon his knees. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than those who came before me. The words fell heavy in the dry air. He had not lost faith in God's existence. He had simply lost faith in his own strength to carry on. And so he lay down beneath the broom tree. The sand warm beneath him. The sky above fading from gold to violet. The world around him quiet except for the faint sigh of wind. He was a man undone. Emptied. Ready for the end. But the desert is a strange place. It strips away all noise, all distraction, all pretense. And in its emptiness, it prepares the soul for something more. Elijah did not yet know it. But God was not finished with him. Though he felt forgotten, he was not alone. Though he prayed for an ending, heaven was preparing renewal. For even here, in this wilderness, beneath this frail tree, beneath this weary heart, the still small voice was drawing near. The voice that would not come in thunder or in fire, but in silence. And in that silence, Elijah would learn again what every heart must learn. That God does not only speak in power, He also speaks in peace. That He is not only found in the fire that falls, but in the whisper that remains after the flame. And so, beneath the broom tree, the prophet slept. His breath shallow, his spirit fragile, his heart waiting, though he did not yet know for what. Night covered the wilderness. Stars shimmered above like promises he could no longer remember. And still, God watched. For even in despair, even in sleep, even in silence, the Lord was near. The night settled deep over the wilderness. The stars shone quietly above Elijah, their light soft against the wide, empty sky. The wind had calmed. Even the sand lay still. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Elijah slept. Not peacefully, but heavily. His body gave in to exhaustion. His spirit drifted between dreams and silence. He had prayed to die. And yet even in his weariness, life still pulsed gently within him. A heartbeat sustained not by will, but by mercy. And in the hush of that desert night, heaven moved near. A presence approached softly. Not with thunder, not with brilliance, but with tenderness. An angel stood beside the prophet, bending low in the faint light. Not to rebuke, not to question, but to care. The angel's hand touched Elijah's shoulder. Gentle, steady. A touch not of power, but of compassion. Arise and eat. The words came quietly, almost like a whisper in the wind. But they carried the weight of heaven's concern. Elijah stirred. His eyes opened slowly. And beside him, on the sand, was bread baked over coals. And a jar of water. The desert still stretched wide and empty. The sun not yet risen. But there, in the place of despair, God had provided. Elijah did not speak. He did not question. He simply ate. He drank slowly, each sip cool against his dry throat. The bread, simple as it was, felt like grace. And when he had finished, he lay down again. The angel did not leave. Heaven does not hurry the weary. God does not rush the broken. So once more, Elijah slept. The desert held him gently. The silence became a blanket. The stars watched over him like 1,000 unspoken prayers. Then again, the touch came, not shaking him awake, but calling him kindly. Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. The words were both command and comfort. Heaven was not finished with him. There was still a road ahead. Elijah sat up slowly. His body still weak, his heart still uncertain. But his soul stirred. For the first time in many days, he felt something that was not despair. It was small, quiet, but it was hope. He looked again, and there, beside him, the bread and water waited once more. As if God himself had returned to remind him that his care does not run out. Elijah ate again, drank again. Each bite was a reminder that even in the wilderness, God provides. Even in the silence, God sustains. Even when all feels lost, God still sends his angels to tend the weary. He did not yet know where the journey would lead. He did not know that Mount Horeb awaited him, that there he would meet the still small voice, that there he would hear again the whisper of divine presence. But this moment beneath the broom tree was the beginning of healing. For before God speaks in power, he often speaks in tenderness. Before he gives direction, he offers rest. Before he reveals his voice, he reminds us of his care. Elijah had cried, "It is enough," and God had answered not with anger, but with nourishment. He had asked for death, and God had given him strength for life. He had fled into the wilderness, alone, and God had met him there. So the prophet rose, slowly, quietly, strengthened by what he could not explain, by food not of his own making, by water drawn from mercy's well. He looked around at the endless stretch of wilderness before him, and though it still seemed vast, he was no longer afraid. For he carried within him what every weary soul needs, the gentle reminder that God had not left him. He wrapped his cloak around himself and began to walk. Each step was quiet, measured, purposeful. He did not know how far the journey would take him. But he knew this: he did not walk alone. And the desert, once barren, seemed softer now. The wind no longer carried only dust. It carried the whisper of grace. For in that silent wilderness, Elijah had not found an end, but a beginning born from rest, from care, from the softest touch of heaven's hand. The prophet walked on, strengthened by bread, sustained by water, guided by a love too gentle for thunder. The wilderness had not changed, but Elijah had. And somewhere far ahead, on the mountain of God, the still small voice waited. The morning dawned softly. The first light stretched over the horizon, washing the desert in gold. The air was cool, the sky endless, and silence hung like a prayer between heaven and earth. Elijah stood once more beneath the broom tree. His body still bore the weariness of his journey, but something unseen had changed. The bread and water given by the angel still lingered in his memory, not just as food, but as presence. As proof that God had not abandoned him. The angel's touch still burned faintly upon his shoulder. Not a wound, not a burden, but a mark of mercy. It was the touch that had roused him from despair. Not to scold him for weakness, but to strengthen him for what lay ahead. He lifted his face toward the horizon and began to walk. The wilderness stretched wide and endless before him. Dry hills rising like waves of stone. The earth cracked beneath his sandals. The air shimmering with heat by day, and cold as silence by night. He did not walk with haste. Each step was slow, deliberate. His mind quiet, his thoughts like echoes carried upon the wind. The angel's words remained within him. The journey is too great for you. Oi! And Elijah knew it was true. He had always been strong, bold before kings, fearless before idols, unshaken in faith. But now, his strength was no longer his own. It came from the unseen grace that had met him beneath the tree. From the God who gave him bread when he had prayed for death. He did not know where his feet would lead. But his heart, slowly, was being led back to life. Days passed. Perhaps weeks. The desert gave him nothing but silence. And yet that silence began to change. At first, it was heavy, a silence of loneliness, of distance. Then, slowly, it became softer. A silence of waiting, of healing, of unseen nearness. Each morning, the sun rose on his left. Each evening, it set on his right, guiding him forward, onward, deeper into the heart of solitude. He drank from small springs when they appeared, rested beneath shadows of rock when they offered shelter. And all the while, strength carried him. Strength that was not his own. For 40 days and 40 nights he walked. The number itself echoing through the ages. The same number that Noah had watched rain fall. The same number that Moses had spent upon the mountain with God. The same number that would one day mark the fasting of the Messiah himself. Elijah was not just traveling through wilderness. He was walking through the long corridor between despair and encounter. Between emptiness and revelation. There were no visions along the way. No voices, no miracles, no thunder from heaven. Only silence. Only distance. Only steps taken in faith, one after another. And yet, in that silence, something within him began to mend. It is often so. The soul must pass through emptiness to be filled again. The noise of fear must fade before the whisper of peace can be heard. Elijah walked, and though the desert remained unchanged, his heart began to awaken. Sometimes, in the stillness, he remembered the angel's touch, the gentle hand upon his shoulder, the quiet voice saying, "Arise and eat." Oi! He would close his eyes and feel it again. And the warmth of that memory became a fire within his chest. Not a flame of wrath, but of quiet love. He began to pray again. Not with loud words or desperate cries, but in the silence of breath and thought. He prayed simply by walking. Each step a surrender, each mile a confession of trust. And though heaven said nothing, he knew he was being heard. The wilderness that once felt empty now felt sacred. Every rock, every gust of wind, every lonely star became a sign of a God who was near enough to feed him, yet mysterious enough to remain unseen. At night, Elijah would lie beneath the wide sky, his cloak drawn around him, the stars like lanterns of eternity above. And he would listen to the silence, to his heartbeat, to the faint rhythm of peace returning. There, between exhaustion and faith, he began to understand that God's presence is not always found in power. Sometimes it is found in persistence, in the quiet choosing to keep walking, even when the path gives no answer. 40 days, 40 nights. And then, one morning, he saw it, rising from the horizon like a shadow carved from the earth. Mount Horeb, the mountain of God. It stood ancient and silent, its slopes steep and solemn, its summit shrouded in the pale veil of dawn. Something within Elijah trembled. Not in fear, but in recognition. For this was the place where Moses had once spoken with God, where commandments had been given, where glory had descended in cloud and flame. The prophet slowed his steps. The air grew cooler, thinner. The wind whispered through narrow paths of rock. The ground rose beneath his feet. He was coming home, not to a place, but to presence. He climbed until his strength faded again, until the weight of the journey pressed upon his chest. And then he found a hollow in the rock, a cave, dark and still. He entered, sat upon the stone, and closed his eyes. Outside, the wind passed like a sigh across the mountain. Inside, Elijah waited. He had come through fire, through fear, through famine, through despair. And now he sat in silence, not knowing what would come next. The angel's touch still lingered, the memory of mercy still warm. And somewhere deep within his weary soul, he felt it, a quiet stirring. The Lord was near. And soon he would speak. But not in thunder, not in fire, not in quake or storm, in stillness, in quiet, in the voice that sounds like peace itself. The wind at Mount Horeb was different, cooler, older, as if it carried the breath of memory. Elijah had arrived. His feet, worn from 40 days of wilderness, now rested upon the stones of the mountain where heaven and earth had met before. Where Moses had once stood barefoot before a bush that burned without consuming. Where commandments were carved by the hand of God. Where cloud and fire had descended upon peaks shrouded in glory. And now, a single weary prophet sat at its base. Silent, waiting. The cave he had found was narrow. A hollow carved by time and weather. The stone smooth and cold to the touch. Inside, shadows lay heavy. But to Elijah, the darkness felt like shelter. A place where he could finally stop running. A place where the noise of fear could fade. The journey had been long. The silence unbroken. Yet here, within the stillness, something within him began to listen. He sat upon the stone floor. Knees drawn close. Cloak wrapped tightly about him. The rhythm of his breathing the only sound in the vast mountain air. He did not speak aloud. For he had said all he could say. He had prayed for death. He had walked through emptiness. He had eaten heaven's bread and drunk from mercy's cup. Now, he simply existed in the quiet between exhaustion and awe. The wilderness had stripped him of everything. His strength. His pride. Even his desire to be seen. All that remained was a soul laid bare before God. And in that stillness, the question came. Not as thunder, not as demand, but as a voice that filled the cave softly, like breath in the dark. What are you doing here, Elijah? The words lingered. Not accusation. Not command. But invitation. It was the kind of question only God can ask, one that does not seek information, but revelation. It was as though the Creator himself was holding up a mirror to the prophet's soul. Asking not for explanation, but for honesty. Elijah bowed his head. And the weight of the journey, the pain of his loneliness, the ache of his calling, poured from his heart like water down stone. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, he whispered, his voice trembling between grief and devotion. The children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek my life, to take it away. The words broke as they left his lips. They were not spoken in pride. They were the cry of a heart that had tried to be faithful and now felt forgotten. It was honesty, not rebellion. Confession, not complaint. He was not angry at God. He was tired. Tired of standing alone. Tired of watching the world fall apart. Tired of being a voice crying out where no one seemed to listen. And yet, even in his weariness, he still spoke to God. He still used the words Lord, God of hosts. Even in despair, he spoke to the one he trusted. That is the strange beauty of faith, that even in silence, it clings. Even in confusion, it reaches out. Elijah's words faded into the dark. The mountain gave no reply. Only the quiet hum of wind moving through unseen cracks. But heaven had heard. For the silence of God is never absence. It is preparation. Outside the cave, the wind began to stir. Not as a storm yet, but as a sign. As if the mountain itself was drawing breath. Elijah did not yet know that what would follow would change his understanding of God forever. He did not yet know that soon he would stand at the mouth of the cave and witness power beyond comprehension. He did not yet know that the voice he sought was not in the thunder, or the fire, or the quake, but in the silence that follows them. But for now, the question remained. What are you doing here, Elijah? And in that question, something sacred stirred, a reminder that God does not abandon his servants to their despair. He calls them out of it. He calls them to step into his presence. The prophet remained still. The mountain breathed. And the silence deepened into something holy. Far below, the desert stretched endless and quiet. Above, clouds gathered slowly around the mountain's crown. Light dimmed, shadows grew. And Elijah waited. He did not rush toward an answer. He did not demand a sign. He simply waited. For sometimes, the holiest act of faith is to wait in the silence until God speaks. He did not know when the voice would come. He only knew that it would. The cave became a temple. The silence became prayer. The mountain became a place of encounter. And somewhere within the stillness, unseen but certain, God began to move. Night leaned upon the ridges of Horeb. And the cave held its quiet like a cup. Elijah rested within its shadow. Wrapped in his cloak. Breath steady but watchful. The question still hovered in the air around him. What are you doing here, Elijah? The words did not accuse. They invited. They stood at the threshold of his soul like an open door, waiting for him to step through with honesty, and wait for God with trust. The mountain listened too. Stone knows how to hold silence. The old peaks had seen cloud and fire in ancient days, had heard commandments spoken, had felt the press of bare feet where holy ground was declared. Now those same stones cradled a weary prophet and the ache of a calling that felt too heavy to carry alone. He lifted his face just enough to feel the faint drift of night air moving along the cave's mouth. Cool. Almost damp. Carrying a trace of desert and distant juniper. He could not name the feeling that gathered inside him. Not fear. Not boldness. Something like readiness without strength. a trembling available to mercy. Then the word came again. Lo! Near. A summons that held no threat. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. He rose slowly, every motion an offering, and came forward until the mouth of the cave framed the dark outside like the border of a psalm yet to be sung. The air shifted. A hush dropped over the ravines, as if the earth itself leaned toward an approach it remembered from long ago. The first wind arrived as a breath, then a sweep, then a force. It ran the length of the mountain with the stride of a giant unseen. It poured through narrow cuts in the rock and found a voice there. A long, keening cry as if the stone itself could sing. Shrubs flattened. Gravel lifted and skittered like quicksilver across the ledges. Loose stones leapt and clattered down the slopes. Elijah braced himself, cloak tight in both hands, feet wedged against the cave's lip. The wind pressed against him like water trying to enter every seam. It pulled at hair and cloth. It tried to take his breath. He bowed into it. Let it pass through and over and around. The mountain shook with the violence of air alone. Yet as the force raged, something truer than fear stood up inside him. A knowing born not of sight but of familiarity with the holy. The Lord had commanded him to stand. But the Lord was not in this tearing. The wind was mighty. But the presence he waited for was not here. The gusts broke apart in tatters, then gathered themselves and charged again. Then finally fled down the ravines like a herd that had been spooked and now sought the plain. Silence limped after it, not quite steady, waiting for the next sound. It came from beneath. First a question in the soles, then a statement in the knees, then an argument in the spine of the world. The ground shuddered. The cave muttered along its length. A deep note rose from hidden places and found every hollow like a drum seeking its skin. The earthquake did not arrive with show. It simply was. As if Horeb remembered its making. Rock spoke to rocking grinds and groans older than songs. Cracks took their first small steps across faces that had never known such lines. Dust lifted in lazy puffs from shelves that had not been touched by hand for 1,000 mornings. Elijah set his shoulder against the door stone. He bent his knees and waited through the roll and stagger of the ground. His heart beat with the same irregular rhythm and then began to find its ordinary pace again. He knew the stories of God and shaking earth, Sinai and thunder, mountains that smoke like furnaces when the holy draws near. But as the floor thrum faded and the last pebbles found their new resting places, the same deep certainty rose within him. The Lord had told him to stand. But the Lord was not in this breaking either. Holiness had not arrived in the fracture. The earthquake had tested the mountain. But the presence he sought would test the man in another way. He waited. The stillness that followed was not yet peace. It was more like a held breath after a cry. The kind of quiet that trembles on its way to becoming calm. He closed his eyes and let the cave's coolness touch his eyelids. Then the heat touched his cheek. Gentle at first, like the warning of a sun that has not yet cleared the horizon. He opened his eyes to a low glow inches beyond the dark frame of rock. A tongue of flame licked the edge of a scrub root clinging to a crack. It did not come from pine pitch or a traveler's ember. It came as if fire remembered this mountain and wanted to visit again. A line of flame found dry grasses and wrote a brief sentence across them. Then another. Then a paragraph. The wind that had been violence a moment ago returned as a careful reader, carrying sparks from line to line until small tongues became many. The heat lifted. The shadows danced and threw themselves against the cave mouth as if they wanted in. Elijah stepped back from the lip. Not in terror, but in awe. His memory opened. Carmel bloomed within it. The altar repaired. The trench filled. The cry. The descent. The sudden hunger of flame for stone and dust and water alike. The people fallen upon their faces. He felt the same wild rightness of God's reality. The sudden clarity faith always brings. But even as the fire made its argument upon Horeb's shoulder, another knowing stood taller in him. The Lord had said stand. But the Lord was not in the fire either. Not today. Not this time. The prophet of fire was being taught another alphabet. Letters made of hush. Grammar written with rest. The flames thinned. Then knelt into embers. Then signed their names in ash and were gone. The smell of what had been burned hung honest and warm. The rock radiated back a memory of heat. Now the mountain lay under a quiet that felt different than all the quiet before. The storm had tried. The quake had spoken. The fire had argued. Now the world seemed to place its finger over its own lips. Elijah did not move. He understood that a threshold is not to be rushed. He let his heartbeat tell seconds in a gentler measure. He let his breath enter and leave like a tide, not interested in hurry. He listened with his bones. The whisper came. Not from far. Not from near. Not from left or right or above or below. It did not come to the ear so much as through the soul. A thin sound. A small voice. A stillness that had learned to speak. It carried no thunder. And broke every argument. It brought no heat. And warmed what fear had cooled. It shook nothing. And yet every weight slid from its place. He drew his cloak about his face. Not to hide from terror, but to honor tenderness. He stepped to the mouth of the cave as one steps into a sanctuary where love has already taken a seat and waits with a smile. Everything in him that had wanted the old proofs, wind to tear, quake to stagger, fire to consume, bowed to the new lesson. God prefers the language of peace when the heart has been frightened by its own zeal. The whisper was not many words, not a torrent of explanation, not a treatise upon suffering and success. It was presence shaped like sound, the companionship of the holy brought to him in a form his weariness could bear. And in that thinness, Elijah knew he was seen. He knew he was not the last. He knew the zeal that had driven him to loneliness would be given companions and successors. He knew the story he had tried to end beneath a broom tree was being written still by a kinder hand than his own. But before understanding would blossom into mission, before names and paths and kings and prophets would be given, the whisper let its first gift do its work: rest. Deep, clean, the kind of rest that does not erase calling but restores it. He stood very still and let it enter him. Behind him the cave kept its cool. Before him the dark expanse softened at the edges as if dawn practiced its lines. The mountain forgot its violence and remembered its age, a kindness older than storms. The wind had said, "I can tear." The earth had said, "I can break." The fire had said, "I can consume." The whisper said, "I am." And everything unnecessary sat down. Elijah lowered his hands slowly. The cloak fell from his face back to his shoulders. He did not feel powerful. He felt kept. He did not feel large. He felt beloved. What had seemed like the loneliness of one became the shelter of one. He remained at the threshold with the patience learned in wilderness. He did not grab for more. The whisper does not reward grasping. It comes best to the open-handed. So he waited a little longer, letting the lesson root as deeply as fear had once rooted. He finally drew back into the cave, not to escape the presence, but to cradle it. He sat again upon the stone where despair had once sat, and found that the stone seemed softer now, as if the mountain itself approved of this new knowing. Outside, a night bird tried a few hesitant notes and then found a melody. The stars above were bright but not loud. They seemed content to be small lights doing faithful work without applause. He understood them in a new way. He rested, not because the world had changed in his favor. Jezebel still ruled. Altars still lay torn in places. Prophets still hid in caves of their own across Israel's hills. But he rested because he had heard the smallest voice and discovered it was strong enough to hold the entire weight of his future. The lonely mountain was lonely no more. It had become a temple again. Not because fire crowned it, but because a whisper had chosen it. And the prophet who had once trusted only fire now trusted silence that speaks with God in it. The night moved toward its thinnest edge. The first pale suggestion of morning touched the far rim of sky. Elijah's eyes closed not from exhaustion now but from peace. He would wake to instruction, to names and paths and the balm of new companions appointed by God's hand. But for this holy interval he let quiet prey inside him. Wind, earthquake, fire, and then the thin hush that holds everything together. The order engraved itself upon his heart. He would carry it to the end of his days. He would teach it with his life. He would pass it like a mantle to those who came after. For the Lord had shown him the way he loves to arrive when souls are bruised, not to bruise further, but to bind up with a voice so gentle it feels like breath against the cheek. Elijah slept at last on Horeb, not hiding from terror, but held by a whisper. And the mountain kept watch, and the stars stood guard, and the God who speaks in the quiet remained near, ready with the next soft sentence that would send a weary servant back into the world, not to burn it down, but to bless it with the peace he had found upon the lonely mountain. The dawn upon Horeb rose softly. The sky shifted from ink to silver, from silver to gold. Light crept over the edges of the mountain, slipping quietly into the cave where Elijah still rested. The prophet stirred, his breath steady, his body no longer heavy with despair. For the first time in many days, he had slept without fear. Not because his troubles had disappeared, but because peace had found him in the silence. He opened his eyes to the faint shimmer of morning light upon the stone. The air was cool, scented faintly with ash and dust. The world outside was still, save for the whisper of wind weaving through narrow canyons below. Elijah rose slowly, his limbs stiff, his spirit quiet. He stepped toward the cave's mouth, and stood there, watching the new day unfold across the desert. There was a hush upon the land, a peace that seemed to breathe through every grain of sand, every glint of light upon rock. The mountain that had trembled beneath storm, quake, and fire now stood calm, dignified, old. And in that calm, the voice came again. Not loud, not thunderous, not echoing from the heights, but near, almost within, as though spoken in the very rhythm of his breathing. What are you doing here, Elijah? The same question as before. Yet now it sounded different. The first time, it had come as a summons, a voice calling a weary man to remember. This time, it came as tenderness, as understanding, as love speaking not to rebuke, but to restore. Elijah bowed his head. He knew the question was not about geography. It was not about location, but vocation. It was not "Why are you here on the mountain?" but "Why have you come to this place in your heart?" Oi. It was the question every soul must face when fear or fatigue lead us into hiding. He closed his eyes, and the memories rose once more, the cries of the people on Mount Carmel, the smoke of the altar, the shouts of repentance, the swift vengeance of Jezebel, the fear that followed, the long road through the wilderness. He remembered his own words beneath the broom tree. It is enough. Take my life. He remembered the angel's touch. The bread. The water. The 40 days of walking. He remembered the wind, the earthquake, the fire. And then the still small voice. And in that remembrance, he answered again. Not as before, with despair, but with a new stillness in his tone. I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. The people have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and slain your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left. And they seek my life, to take it away. The words were the same, but their meaning had shifted. Before, they were a cry of loneliness, of surrender, of weariness. Now, they were confession, an open heart before the one who listens. He was not merely lamenting his solitude. He was naming it, releasing it, placing it back into God's hands. The voice did not answer with explanation or correction. It did not argue, did not debate. Instead, it filled the air around him with quiet understanding. For God's compassion often replies not with more words, but with purpose. And in that holy silence, Elijah felt it, the change. The still small voice had done its work. It had reached the place where thunder could not reach. It had touched not his mind alone, but his heart. He no longer felt forsaken. He no longer believed he was the only one left. In the hush of that mountain, Elijah began to perceive what he could not see before. He was not alone. He had never been. Even when he fled, God was with him. Even when he slept beneath the broom tree, the angels were near. Even when his courage failed, mercy did not. The question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" was not heaven's accusation. It was heaven's invitation. An invitation to return. To stand again. To live again. To serve again. And Elijah understood. God does not abandon his servants to their despair. He meets them in it. He does not silence their fear with force. He quiets it with gentleness. He does not demand they stand strong. He strengthens them until they can. The prophet felt tears gather. Not of grief, but of release. He looked out across the vastness of the land below. Miles of wilderness, valleys, and paths unseen. And he knew. His journey was not ending here. The mountain had not been his escape. It had been his renewal. God had drawn him here not to hide him, but to heal him. And soon, the voice that spoke in stillness would send him back into the world. Back into purpose. Back into life. But not yet. For a moment longer, Elijah stood in the doorway of the cave. The breeze moved gently past him. He breathed it in, deep, slow, steady. The silence was no longer emptiness. It was communion. The mountain was no longer loneliness. It was sanctuary. And the question was no longer sorrow. It was promise. He would never forget the sound of that voice. Not thunder, not command, but tenderness wrapped in light. The same voice that speaks even now. Across centuries. Into the hearts of those who are tired, afraid, or alone. What are you doing here, my child? And in that whisper, we too are invited to return, to rest, to begin again. The cave was still. The air within it moved softly, like the breath of one who listens. Outside, the morning wind stirred dust and light upon the mountain slopes. But inside, time seemed to stand still. Elijah remained at the edge of the shadow, his hands resting upon the stone, his head bowed. The words he had spoken still lingering in the quiet between him and God. He had spoken the truth of his heart, raw, trembling, honest. It was not rebellion, not complaint, but the sound of a soul that could no longer carry the weight of its calling alone. He had stood for righteousness, prayed for rain, called down fire, faced down kings. He had obeyed when few dared, spoken when all were silent. He had done everything faith had asked of him. And yet now, he felt as though his courage had turned to dust. He whispered again, softer now, as if to the wind itself. I have been zealous for you, Lord. But I am tired. So tired. I have stood alone. And my heart cannot bear it any more. His voice trembled. Not with anger, but with weariness. With that holy fatigue known only by those who have poured themselves out completely. He was not angry that others had fallen away. He was simply broken that faith had not been enough to change them. And yet, even as he spoke, something within his words shifted. They were not the cries of a man demanding answers. They were the confessions of one who still believed God was listening. Every word that fell from his lips was both a wound and a prayer. He thought of the faces of those he had preached to. The flicker of conviction in their eyes on Mount Carmel. And how quickly that light had faded. He thought of Jezebel's hatred. Relentless and cruel. A shadow that seemed to stretch over all he had tried to restore. He thought of the altars broken, the prophets slain, the people wandering between idols and truth. It was too much for one man. And yet, even now, in this hollow of stone, he could not stop caring. He pressed his palms against the cold rock, as though to steady himself against the ache inside. He whispered again. Not to justify, not to explain, but to be heard. Lord, they have torn down your altars. They have turned away. And I have tried. But I am only one. The silence that followed was not cruel. It was the silence of a father listening with love. For when God listens, he does not interrupt. He lets the heart empty itself until the weight that once crushed it has room for peace again. And so Elijah spoke until the words were gone, until all that remained were slow breaths and quiet tears. He leaned back against the cave wall, eyes closed. The mountain's stillness wrapped around him like a cloak. And in that stillness, he began to understand what he could not see before. He was not the only one left. He was not the last flame flickering in the darkness. There were still others. Hidden, faithful, unseen. 7,000 who had not bowed to Baal. Lives preserved by grace, kept safe in silence. But even before the Lord revealed that truth, Elijah could feel it. Not through logic, but through love. The love that had fed him, guided him, and met him in his despair. He realized that God had not called him to carry the burden of all Israel, only to walk faithfully with the God who carried him. The cry that had once been filled with sorrow began to soften. He felt peace creeping in, not suddenly, not loudly, but like water seeping through cracks in stone. Tears still touched his cheeks, but they were no longer the tears of despair. They were the tears of one who finally lets go. He opened his eyes and looked toward the mouth of the cave. The sunlight had grown brighter, the air warmer, the day unfolding quietly before him. It was as if the mountain itself breathed with him, inhaling light, exhaling calm. Elijah realized that the God who sent fire from heaven was also the God who sent whispers in the wind. The one who shook mountains with thunder was the same who held him now with silence. And for the first time since the journey began, he felt something return to him, not the old zeal that burned hot and fast, but a steadier flame. Gentler, deeper, stronger. It was not the fire of confrontation, but the glow of communion. He did not yet know what God would say next, what instructions would come, what mission would await him beyond the mountain. But he knew this, he had been heard. The cry of his heart had not disappeared into emptiness. It had reached the ear of heaven, and heaven had answered with presence. For when the soul cries out to God, even if the words are weary, even if the faith is faint, even if the hope is barely alive, the Lord listens. He does not measure the volume of the cry, only the sincerity of the heart. And in that cave, on that sacred mountain, Elijah's cry became a prayer that touched eternity. He was no longer the prophet who fled. He was the prophet who had been found. The same God who met him in fire had now met him in silence. And in that silence, he found what he had truly needed all along, not proof of power, but assurance of love. Outside, the sun lifted higher. The shadows shortened. The light grew soft and golden. And deep within the mountain, peace lingered. Elijah did not speak again. He did not need to. The mountain had heard his cry, and heaven had answered with quiet. The mountain waited. Ancient rock kept its quiet. Shadows lay like folded garments across the ridges, and the cave held the breath of the morning as a sanctuary holds prayer. Elijah remained near the opening. Cloak gathered close, eyes soft with the weariness that had begun to loosen its hold. The question had done its work. The cry had emptied the heart, and the silence had become a friend. Then the summons came again. Not sharp, not urgent, but clear. A nearness that drew the soul forward like tide toward moonlight. Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord. Elijah rose, not with the haste of fear, but with the steadiness that follows trust. He stepped until the line between cave and sky lay at his feet. Stone fell away beneath him into long shelves and pale slopes. Far beyond, the desert spread like a quiet sea. Above, the high air glowed with the cool brightness that comes before heat. The world paused. Even the wind seemed to hold itself still. Then the breath returned, first as a sigh along the cliff face, then as a tug at the hem of his cloak, then as a sweep that found its voice in the crevices and sang there with wildness. The wind gathered itself. It did not whisper now. It strode. It drove across the spines of Horeb with strength that carried pebbles as if they were seeds and pushed shrubs flat as if smoothing a bed. It slid into ravines and came out sharpened, a blade made of air. It found the thin soils and lifted them into veils of dust that wove and unwove above the ledges. Elijah set his feet firm. He bent a little into the force. His hands caught the edge of the cloak at his throat and held it close. The wind pressed against his chest until breath felt like work. It pushed at knees and shoulders and found every seam in garment and hair. The mountain answered with a roar of its own, not rebellion, but resonance. Openings became flutes. Corners became drums. And the whole ridge seemed to speak in a tongue older than speech. Yet within the clamor, within the violence that could peel bark from stubborn roots and scatter nests from hidden crannies, a quieter knowing rose in him like spring rising under stone. The Lord had called him to stand. The Lord was passing by. But the Lord was not in this tearing. The gale tried again. It came with a rush that made the scrub bow low and the tall grasses race one way and then the other like the handwriting of a giant child. It writhed against rock faces and clawed at the brow of the cave. Gravel spat and danced in circles. A fallen branch scraped along the ledge and went over into the bright air. Still he held his ground. Not in stubbornness, but in obedience. The force that could shame trees was not permitted to shame his soul. He would not read presence by volume. He would not mistake power for voice. The memory of Carmel flickered. Fire there had answered faith. Wind here only tested waiting. He allowed the thought to pass like a cloud shaped by the current. Not clung to. Not feared. Simply seen. The wind altered its song. It lowered into a long howl. rose into a keen, broke into a scatter of gasps, then fell suddenly as if some unseen hand had pressed a palm upon the world and said, "Enough." The air, relieved of its struggle, smoothed itself along the stone. Sand settled with tiny sighs. Small stones came to rest with soft ticks. Shrubs lifted their heads again and took stock of their leaves. Elijah's breathing steadied. He loosened one hand from the cloak and placed it upon the cave's rim. The rock beneath his palm felt cool and certain. The pulse in his wrist calmed to a rhythm that matched the mountain's slow heart. The mind remembered how easily strength captivates. Arts love spectacle. Cities cheer loudness. Yet the soul knows another language. The holy does not need to shout to be sovereign. The wind had declared what air can do when it is angry or free. But it had not introduced the one Elijah waited for. There is a way noise masquerades as nearness. A way force pretends to be presence. He had learned this by rivers and palaces and altars. Now the lesson came with air alone. He stepped a finger's width closer to the light beyond the cave mouth. He let his gaze travel along the ridgelines to the far pale horizon where desert met sky in a quiet vow. The hush following fury always feels larger than the hush before it. As if the world has discovered its own boundaries and is content again to dwell within them. A small whirl caught a ribbon of dust and drew a circle around his sandals. Then that too released and drifted away like a heart choosing forgiveness. Elijah's thoughts curled toward prayer without words. A simple offering of attention. A laying down of argument. A willingness to be small before a love that has no need to prove itself with storms. The wind's departure left behind a clarity. Edges sharpened. Colors deepened. Sounds from far away returned to audibility, the single click of a beetle against grit. The distant clatter of a loosened stone finally finding its rest. The faintest thread of birdsong testing the air again. He recognized the kindness beneath the testing. He had long wanted God to come with proof that silences every rival. But the Lord's mercy had turned his desire upon its head. It was not wind that would keep him. It was not spectacle that would sustain him back among altars and kings. It would be a voice so light it could be missed by haste. A voice that could only be caught by a heart already leaning close. He understood a little more of why he had been led here. The prophet of fire needed to learn the patience of breeze without thunder. The servant who had stood fearless before crowds needed the gentler courage that stands before stillness and does not flinch. The man who had thought himself alone needed to learn how the presence draws nearest after the noise has failed to impress. The mountain breathed again. A long exhale over miles of stone. As if Horeb itself were relieved that the tearing had ended. The cave gathered the softened air and returned it as coolness upon his skin. He closed his eyes, not to retreat, but to listen more carefully. The ear can be fooled by wind. The soul cannot. What he waited for would not bully its way into attention. It would arrive the way light arrives through a thin crack in a shuttered room. simply, beautifully, irresistibly. Moments passed like leaves drifting on a slow stream. He did not count them. He simply let his standing be prayer. Behind his lids, bright shapes trembled, the afterimage of sky. His fingers eased their hold on the cloak's edge. His shoulders unwound from the posture of bracing and found the posture of receiving. He remembered the angel's touch beneath the broom tree. The bread. The water. Quiet mercies that had not needed fanfare to save him. The same God who had come by crust and cup would not abandon him to storms for speech. A small breeze returned, gentle as breath across the cheek of a sleeping child. It carried the scent of mineral and a memory of char from last night's embers. It did not push. It companioned. He opened his eyes to the brightening day. There was no triumph in the sky. Only beauty. There was no army moving along the valley floor. Only light. The wind had passed, and the Lord had not been in it. The lesson lay clear as tracks in clean sand. He bowed his head a fraction, a nod offered to the wisdom that had revealed itself in restraint. The soul, calmed by obedience, prepared for whatever would follow. Beyond him the mountain readied its next sentence. Far within, the cave kept quiet like a reader between chapters. The world had stopped shouting, and the heart, at last, could hear. What came next would shake the ground and stain the air with brightness. And still the Lord would not be in those either. For the Holy had chosen another doorway for his nearness. A thin place where sound becomes almost silence and silence becomes almost sound. But for now, let the wind's memory fade. Let the dust settle back into the small companionships it knows with root and stone. Let the prophet rest upon the ledge of attention, not straining, not slumping, simply there. The Lord passes by in patience. The Lord declines to be mistaken for the loudest thing. The Lord prepares a whisper. Elijah waited. And the mountain, wiser than men and kings, waited with him. Until the next movement of the lesson unfolded upon its ancient shoulders. And the still small voice drew nearer by doing what force cannot do, making room for peace. The wind was gone. Its wild cry faded into memory. The mountain stood silent again, as if the breath of creation had paused to rest. Elijah waited, his hands still upon the stone. His heart steady, his gaze fixed upon the horizon that shimmered faintly with heat. The quiet after the wind felt heavy, vast. Not absence, but expectancy. As though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next note in a song too sacred to rush. And then the ground began to move. At first, it was small, a tremor, a murmur beneath his feet. Like the stirring of something ancient beneath the surface. But then it deepened. It spread through the mountain like a wave of unseen thunder. The cave shuddered. The walls cracked in soft groans. Stones rolled loose from ledges and fell in dull echoes down the slope. Elijah steadied himself, pressing a hand to the rock beside him, feeling its life beneath his palm. The ground rippled, shook, sighed. The air filled with the sound of stone grinding against stone. The deep groan of the earth remembering its own creation. Dust rose around him. The world swayed. The mountain seemed to breathe, not with peace, but with power. Elijah bowed his head and closed his eyes. He had felt the power of God before. On Carmel, in flame and thunder, in the rain that had come after years of drought. He had known what it was for heaven to shake the earth. And yet, even in the quake, he knew this was not the voice. This was not the presence he had been called to witness. For the Lord had taught him something in the silence between storms. Power may move the ground, but peace moves the soul. The shaking grew stronger. Rocks broke from the cliff face and tumbled down into the valley. The cave moaned like a living creature. Still Elijah did not run. He leaned into the stone and let the trembling pass through him, until the shaking became stillness again. And when the mountain ceased its groaning, a deep calm followed. Not silence born of emptiness, but silence born of awe. As though creation itself had bowed low before its maker. The dust settled slowly. Each grain fell like a prayer returning to its source. And Elijah lifted his head once more. The world was changed, not outwardly, but inwardly. The mountain seemed to hum with quiet life. As if what had shaken it had not been destruction, but purification. Then came light. It began as a shimmer, a faint glimmer in the corner of his vision. Then a spark, a flicker, a pulse that danced upon the wind. Fire. It moved across the ridges like breath turned visible. Flames trailing gold and crimson. Tongues of light licking the stone, running through dry brush, weaving between shadows. It did not consume in wrath. It danced in glory. The air grew warm, the sky glowed like copper. Elijah stepped back a little, covering his face with his cloak. The fire's brightness was too much to bear. Its heat too pure. The mountain, once grey and still, now burned with living light. He remembered Carmel. The fire that had fallen there had been a sign. Proof of God's power to a nation that had forgotten him. That fire had come with judgment, with awe, with the weight of heaven's authority. But this fire was different. It did not roar. It whispered. It did not destroy. It purified. It did not consume the prophet. It surrounded him in light without harm. Still, Elijah knew. The Lord was not in the fire. Not because fire was unholy, but because God was teaching him something beyond power. The God who once spoke through fire was now revealing himself through gentleness, through restraint, through peace. Elijah lowered his head, trembling not from fear, but from realization. He understood that God was showing him all the ways he could appear: wind, earthquake, fire, and then revealing the greater truth, that his heart chooses another way. The wind showed his strength. The earthquake showed his sovereignty. The fire showed his purity. But what came next would show his heart. As the flames faded, their glow dimming into faint embers that winked and cooled upon the stone, Elijah felt the mountain sigh again. All that was fierce had passed. All that was loud had gone quiet. Only stillness remained. And in that stillness, a presence. Not seen, not touched, but known. The mountain, the prophet, the very air, all seemed to lean toward the center of that stillness. Elijah closed his eyes. And in that silence, he heard it. Not a word first, but a feeling. A warmth without heat. A sound smaller than sound. A still small voice. He pulled his cloak around his face. His knees weakened. His breath slowed. For this was what he had come for. Not to see the mountain move. Not to see the fire burn. But to feel the whisper of the one who speaks not to the ears, but to the soul. He did not need to understand the words. He only needed to know the speaker. And in that whisper, the prophet who had once fled from fear now found peace. The Lord had passed by. Not in the wind that breaks. Not in the earth that shakes. Not in the fire that burns. But in the stillness that heals. Silence gathered upon Horeb like evening light settling over water. It did not press. It enfolded. It did not command. It invited. The wind's memory faded, the tremor's echo lay down in the valleys. The last faint ember from the passing flame winked and went to sleep within its ash. Elijah stood at the mouth of the cave with his cloak drawn about his face. Not to hide from terror, but to honor tenderness. His hands, rough with years of building altars and lifting stones, learned a new posture. Not braced against force, but open to presence. His breathing found the patient rhythm of a man who has stopped arguing with the world and begun listening for God. The voice came the way dawn comes through a shutter's seam. Thin. Certain. Gentle. A nearness that did not travel across distance because it had always been here. It was not a word loud enough to startle birds from branches. It was not a tone strong enough to rattle rock from ledge. It was the kindness of God shaped as sound. It did not hurry him. It did not heap demands. It did not weigh him down with explanations heavy as stone. It spoke the way rain speaks to a thirsting field. Soft. Enough. Again. Peace preceded it like fragrance carried ahead of a friend on the path. Then the whisper reached the place in him no thunder had touched. Beloved. Not a term said aloud, yet truer than any name spoken over him since childhood. The word rose within the quiet the way a spring rises beneath sand, unseen until it is felt, then felt until it is trusted. The whisper moved through the story he had brought to this mountain. It traced the lines of his fatigue without scolding. It rested a moment upon the bruise where fear had struck his courage and did not press. It remembered the broom tree, the bread, the water, and called them by their real names: mercy, provision, presence. Elijah trembled, not with dread, but with relief. The weight began to loosen along the ribs where he had stored his vigilance. The tight fist around his calling learned slowly to open. He had thought only power could steady a prophet. Here, gentleness steadied a man. The voice held another quality. Like light upon shallow water, clarity without glare. It did not argue with the darkness he had named. It simply revealed that darkness had never been the final word. You are seen. The words did not strike. They settled. They found the place where loneliness had convinced him he was last and only. They spread there like balm. You are kept. Not because he had outrun enemies. Not because he had outlasted storms. But because keeping is what love does when its beloved is weary. You are mine. The mountain heard it too. Or so it seemed. For stone that had groaned beneath quake now held still the way a faithful hand holds a trembling one. The air cooled upon his forehead. The small hairs along his arms rose as if each were a sentinel greeting a passing king. The whisper asked nothing yet. It gave. First rest. Then reassurance. Then the soft courage that grows where safety settles. Elijah felt memory begin to breathe differently. He saw Carmel again. But now more than fire. He saw the patient altar building stone upon stone. A picture of how God's work often comes to hearts, not in leaps, but in faithful placements. He saw the widow's jar. The flour that did not end. The oil that did not fail. He remembered that provision had been the verse God chose to sing over him long before power had been the chorus sung over a nation. He lowered his head a fraction more. The cloak brushed his cheek like the wing of a quiet bird. In the shadow of that simple covering he found another covering. Mercy spread across his life like shade at noon. The whisper touched his fear without granting it authority. The Queen's rage still lived beyond this ridge. The broken altars still lay scattered on familiar hills. The nation still wavered in its loyalties. None of that was denied. And yet, fear lost its crown. It sat down like a loud guest who realizes the host of the house is someone else. The voice did not swell. It stayed small. It taught by remaining what it was. If God would come near in a way gentle enough for grief to bear, then gentleness must be holy. If God would speak in a sound thin as a breath, then a breath could carry heaven. If God would be present without spectacle, then presence itself would become the miracle. Elijah understood something he had not known how to say. The fire on Carmel had turned a nation's head for a day. The whisper on Horeb would turn a prophet's heart for a lifetime. He listened deeper. There, under the first gift of rest, another gift waited, truth that stands without strain. He felt the lie he had nursed in the wilderness loosen like an old knot. I alone am left. The whisper did not contradict with volume. It unmade with love. It let him feel, as surely as he felt stone beneath his feet, that faith had never been solitary as he feared. Unseen ones prayed in caves he had never entered. Hidden ones kept covenant in homes he would never visit. Remnant existed because God exists. The whisper lingered there. Long enough for loneliness to learn it had misnamed the room. He was not alone. He had been lonely. There is a difference. One is a fact corrected by fellowship. The other is a feeling corrected by nearness. He wept. Not with the heat of despair, but with the cool relief of being held. Tears washed the grit gathered by long miles. They baptized the old story and let it drift from him like silt from a stirred spring. The mountain did not mock his softness. Holiness honors tears. The prophet who had once outrun chariots now stood still and let love run to him. The whisper shaped his attention toward the future without pulling him from the present. It did not hand him maps. It did not unroll long lists. It gave him the shape of trust, step. Then step. Then step. The same way he had crossed the barren land from Broom Tree to Horeb. In that shape he sensed hints, not commands yet, not names yet, just the promise that purpose would rise from peace, not pressure. That sending would come from healing, not hurry. That obedience would feel like joining something already in motion rather than dragging a burden uphill alone. He breathed, and the breath itself became prayer. He stood, and his standing itself became worship. He watched the light gather along the far rim of the sky until the desert's pale floor took back its colors. And he knew, the world had not changed, but his place within it had. Not higher. Taller. If the holy chooses a whisper, then the servant must learn to move at whisper speed. To check the heart before checking the horizon. To wait until peace says now. To speak after listening long enough to love the ones who must hear. The voice rested at last, not gone. Abiding. It had made its home within the quiet places wind could not reach and fire could not scorch. The cave behind him felt less like a refuge and more like a chapel. The ledge before him felt less like an edge and more like a threshold. He let the cloak slip from his face. The morning touched his skin without sting. He felt smaller than his task and more secure than his fear. The strange, welcome pairing of humility and confidence took root. Humility because the work was God's. Confidence because the worker was near. He did not speak aloud. There was no vow to make, no plan to announce, no swearing of oaths to prove he had learned. He simply yielded his weight to the truth that had held him up while he listened. A small bird tested the air and landed upon a twig left unbroken by the storm. It shook its feathers, lifted its head, and sang 3 short notes. Nothing grand. Enough to say, "I am here." Elijah heard in it the same theology the mountain had taught: presence first, then song. He stayed a little longer, letting the whisper echo until it did not echo anymore, but lived in him as steady as pulse. Letting the lesson rest until it did not feel like a lesson, but like the kindness he wanted most to offer the world he would soon re-enter. He would walk down from Horeb. He would meet roads where fear still stalked. He would stand again before rulers whose names filled rooms with dread. He would look into eyes that searched the sky for fire and teach those eyes to search their hearts for God. But for this holy span of mourning, he remained. A man remade not by spectacle, but by stillness. Not by display, but by devotion. Not by a shout from above, but by a whisper within. And the one who had spoken did not depart. Presence is not a visitor when love has chosen to dwell. The mountain wore its quiet like a crown. The prophet wore peace like an unseen mantle laid across the shoulders by hands that never tire. The day opened its palm to him. He received it, not as a test to pass, but as a gift to carry. The still small voice had done what thunder could not. It had found the most guarded room and sat down there with him. It had lit a lamp that no wind could snuff. It had shown him that God's nearness is not the exception at the end of miracles, but the foundation beneath every step. Elijah turned his face toward the light. And the light did not blind. It blessed. He breathed once more, slow, steady, grateful. And the mountain seemed to breathe with him. Somewhere below, a path waited. Somewhere ahead, a task would be given. Somewhere within, a peace would remain. For the Lord had spoken. Not in the wind that tears, not in the quake that breaks, not in the fire that burns, but in the whisper that heals. And the heart that heard would carry that whisper into a world still learning how to listen. The mountain was quiet again. Not the hollow quiet of fear, but the deep calm that follows encounter. Elijah stood still, breathing the silence as though it were air made new. Every sound he had once known, the wind, the quake, the fire, seemed far away now. What surrounded him was not emptiness. It was presence, gentle and complete. He did not need words, for silence had become its own language. It spoke of things too deep for sound: mercy, peace, and the certainty that God was near. He turned slightly toward the cave, where the stone walls glowed faintly with reflected light. Each crack, each shadow seemed holy now. For in this place, the unspoken had become revelation. There are silences that wound, and silences that heal. Elijah had known both. He had fled into the wilderness once because silence felt like God's absence. But now he understood. The truest silence is not God withholding his voice. It is God allowing his peace to enter deeper than words can reach. The whisper had ended. But its echo remained, not in the air, but in the heart. It said, "Be still and know." And in that knowing, Elijah found rest. He sat upon a stone near the mouth of the cave. The light fell across his knees in thin bands. Dust floated through the air like small prayers unhurried in their journey to heaven. He realized something simple. God had not changed, only his hearing had. For years, Elijah had believed that God's work was always loud, dramatic, undeniable. But here, on this mountain, God had taught him that the divine is not always revealed in power. Sometimes it is revealed in patience. Sometimes, the silence that follows the storm carries more of God's heart than the thunder ever could. He breathed deeply, slow and steady, letting the quiet settle like dew upon his soul. This silence did not demand anything from him. It did not push or pull. It only waited with him. It told him that peace is not the absence of trouble. It is the presence of God amid it. And the prophet understood. This was the message he had been sent to learn before he could be sent again. The fire on Carmel had proven God's might. But this silence on Horeb revealed his nature. It taught Elijah that heaven's greatest power is gentleness, and that strength is not found in noise, but in stillness. He looked out over the valley below. The land stretched endless and quiet, touched by the first warmth of noon. The same earth that had shaken hours ago now lay calm, unmoved. He smiled faintly, for he knew his heart had learned to do the same. Faith, he realized, is not built upon signs, but upon presence. Not upon what shakes the ground, but upon what steadies it. He closed his eyes again, listened to the silence, and within it, he could almost hear the rhythm of creation itself, the pulse of all living things moving under the hand of their Maker. It was as if the world was praying without words. As if the rocks and the wind and his own heartbeat all joined in one quiet worship. And Elijah knew, this was how God truly speaks. Not always through miracles. Not always through angels. But often through stillness. The silence itself had become sacred. It told him, "You are not alone. You are not forgotten. And you are not done." He felt warmth settle within him. Not fire this time, but peace. Steady and kind. The prophet who had once cried for death beneath a broom tree now sat alive in the quiet of God's nearness. And the silence spoke again, not with sound, but with certainty. Rest now, for you are loved. The hush upon Horeb held steady, like a hand resting lightly over a racing heart until it remembers its proper rhythm. Elijah remained near the cave's mouth. neither rushing forward nor retreating inward. Simply staying. Letting the stillness teach what thunder could not. Understanding did not arrive as a flash. It unfolded like dawn. Thin at first. Then sure. Then warm. The prophet began to see that the wilderness had not been a detour from calling. It had been its doorway. The broom tree had not marked the end of usefulness. It had marked the end of self-reliance. He looked back within his memory and found new meaning in old scenes. The flour that had not run out. The oil that had not failed. The child raised from stillness to breathing again. The fire that had fallen upon an altar drenched in water. Each moment had been more than proof. It had been a parable. A gentle insistence from heaven that power is real, yes. But mercy is the heart behind it. He saw himself upon Carmel. Strong. Certain. Words like arrows. Zeal like a flame. It had been necessary then. A trumpet for deaf ears. Yet here, upon Horeb, the Lord had shown the more enduring weapon. Not spectacle, but presence. Not volume, but nearness. Not the crushing of enemies, but the mending of hearts. Elijah lowered himself onto a flat stone, palms open upon his knees. The mountain air moved across his skin like water. Cool. Patient. He breathed with it. And as breath slowed, the soul listened. And as the soul listened, it learned. Strength, he realized, is not the same as strain. The holy does not prove himself by exhausting his servants. He proves himself by restoring them. By meeting them where they break and calling that meeting place holy. Elijah let this truth sit inside him until it felt familiar. He could taste its goodness like bread still warm from coals. He could feel its weight like a mantle woven of quiet threads. Mercy is not a soft escape from duty. It is the atmosphere in which duty becomes worship. In mercy, obedience is not a burden carried alone. It is a companionship. God's will beside a willing heart. He considered the lie that had traveled with him through desert miles. I alone am left. The whisper had untied that knot without argument. There were others. Hidden. Faithful. Kept by the same hand that had kept him. His task was not to be the whole story. His task was to be faithful to his sentence within it. The author would carry the plot to its promised end. The prophet rose and stood once more at the opening. Below him the land lay quiet, its lines softened by light. He noticed small things he had not seen when fear was loud. A bird stitching the air from one thorn to another. A thin green along a crease of stone where water must sometimes linger. A drift of pale flowers brave enough to bloom in hard country. They preached without words. Life persists where mercy attends. He thought of the question asked twice. What are you doing here, Elijah? It had sounded like inquiry. But now he heard its kindness. It was invitation. Come into the truth of who you are before me. Lay down the armor you forged from loneliness. Receive the peace that arms you better than iron. Then go. Not as a storm, but as a servant who has learned the sound of my steps. Gentleness began to feel like courage rather than concession. The world knows how to answer a shout with a shout. It does not know what to do with a soul at rest. Elijah understood that the kingdom advances like seed, not like spear, and that the voice which healed him here would be the voice guiding him there. He turned inward for a moment and found gratitude rising like a spring. He thanked God for the angel's touch, for bread and water that had tasted of faithfulness, for the road that had been long enough to empty him and long enough to fill him again, for the wind that did not claim divinity, for the quake that yielded to quiet, for the fire that bowed before a whisper. He smiled, small, honest, a curve formed by relief rather than triumph. He knew the path ahead would still pass through risk. Jezebel's fury had not cooled. Altars still waited to be rebuilt in unseen places. Yet fear no longer led the procession of his thoughts. Peace did. And duty walked behind it like a friend content to be second. Obedience, he realized, is not hurry. It is alignment. It is the heart standing where God stands and moving when God moves. It is a pace set by presence, not by pressure. He practiced that pace there on the stone, one breath offered, one received. A prayer without words. A yes without striving. He could sense, like scent before sight, that instructions would come. Names to anoint. Paths to walk. Companions to find. But command would rise from communion, not replace it. The mountain grew brighter. Noon drew near. The cave behind him felt less like refuge and more like remembrance. A place he would carry within rather than cling to without. For once a heart has learned the tongue of silence, it can hear that language anywhere. In court or field. At altar or table. In victory or in wait. He let his hands fall to his sides. He let his shoulders open. He let the last remnants of self-accusation drain away like water from a cleansed cup. The Lord had not come to scold a prophet into usefulness. He had come to love a man into faithfulness. Elijah lifted his face to the light and offered the simplest prayer a human can give, the prayer that sounds like breathing. Yes. 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 He would go when sent. He would speak when given words. He would be quiet when quiet would heal. He would measure success not by noise or number, but by nearness. The still small voice did not repeat itself. It did not need to. Its work was done, not finished as in ended, but finished as informed. A new understanding held him like a strong, gentle hand taking his and guiding him down the first steps of a familiar mountain made new. And with that, the prophet stood ready. Not larger than before, but lighter. Not fiercer, but truer. Carrying within him a kingdom that prefers whispers to wars, mercy to display, obedience to hurry, and love to fear. The mountain's shadow had begun to shift. The light now touched the stone at Elijah's feet with quiet warmth. And in that light, the prophet felt something stir within him, not the old fire of zeal, but something softer, something stronger. Faith. Renewed. It did not rush through him like a storm. It rose like dawn. It grew from stillness, from trust, from the memory of a voice too gentle to forget. He took one more step toward the open air, letting the sunlight rest upon his face. It felt almost like blessing, a reminder that God's mercy shines even in places where despair once camped. He breathed deeply. The air was cool and pure. The mountain no longer felt lonely. It felt alive. For the first time in many days, his thoughts did not chase the fears that had hunted him. They rested, steady, like water finally finding its level. He remembered the road that had brought him here, the wilderness miles, the empty hunger, the prayer beneath the broom tree, the angel's bread, the long silence, the wind, the earthquake, the fire. And finally, the whisper. Each moment had been a thread. And now he could see what the threads had woven. Not a story of failure, but a tapestry of faith. He had thought God had abandoned him, but every step had been guided. Every silence had been filled with unseen grace. Renewal, he realized, does not always come with new strength. Sometimes, it comes with surrendered strength. The heart learns to stop striving and starts trusting. He smiled faintly at the thought. The faith that once shouted now whispered. And yet, it felt deeper, fuller, truer. He had learned that faith is not proven by victory. It is proven by endurance, by the quiet decision to keep walking when you cannot yet see the path ahead. He looked across the horizon. The land stretched wide and golden, a soft sea of sand and rock. The same land that had once felt barren now looked full of promise. For the soul that has been healed can see beauty even in the wilderness. Elijah turned his eyes upward, toward the endless blue. And he whispered, not with demand, but with gratitude. You were here all along. It was not a revelation of words, but of being. God had not left him to die beneath the tree. He had not abandoned him to silence. He had led him to this mountain to restore the very faith that had carried him here. Renewal had not come through answers. It had come through presence. Faith, when renewed, does not ask for proof. It simply remembers. He remembered the bread placed beside him when he had given up. He remembered the still small voice that had met him in his exhaustion. He remembered that the same God who calms storms can calm hearts. And he knew he would go back down from this mountain different. Not with a louder voice, but with a quieter soul. The kind of quiet that carries peace into every storm it meets. He reached down and touched the ground. The same ground that had shaken beneath him. And smiled. Even trembling earth can teach faith. For it shows that what truly endures is not the stone, but the spirit that steadies it. He thought again of the question that had been asked twice. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" At last, he understood. He was here to remember who God truly is. He was here to remember who he truly is. A servant. A vessel. A messenger. But also a son. Loved not for what he does, but for who he belongs to. Faith was no longer something he carried. It carried him. He sat again, just for a moment. Not from weakness, but to rest once more in gratitude. The mountain air hummed quietly. This time, his silence was not heavy. It was holy. He had met God in the quiet. And that meeting had become the center of his life. The prophet who had once feared death now welcomed peace. The man who had once asked to die now longed to live, not for himself, but for the one who had spoken in the stillness. Faith had returned. Not as a blaze to burn fast and fierce, but as a steady flame that would never go out. He rose slowly. The light had shifted again, and the desert below shimmered in calm gold. The path downward waited. The world had not changed. But Elijah had. And sometimes, that is the only miracle needed. He whispered one last prayer before he began his descent. "Teach me to hear you, even when you are silent." Then he took his first step down from the mountain, not fleeing anymore. Not searching anymore, but walking with peace. For faith, once renewed, is not the loud confidence that demands answers. It is the quiet certainty that God is already near. The light upon Horeb had softened. The kind of light that falls near afternoon, mellow and kind. Elijah remained near the edge of the mountain, eyes lifted toward the horizon that stretched into quiet distance. He felt rested, emptied, filled again. Not with strength as before, but with peace. He had waited long enough in the stillness to know what it was for heaven to draw close. The whisper still lingered in his heart, gentle, unhurried. And from that quiet, purpose began to rise. When God speaks in a whisper, the message is never loud. Yet it carries more weight than thunder. And the Lord said to Elijah, "Go. Return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. Anoint Jehu son of Nimshi to be king over Israel. And anoint Elisha, the son of Shaphat, to be prophet in your place." The words were clear, simple, and steady. No grand speech. No long explanation. Only direction. Elijah listened. Not as a man receiving orders, but as one receiving trust. He bowed his head. The mission was not a burden, it was a gift. It meant that heaven had not finished with him. The Lord had not called him to Horeb to end his story. He had called him to begin it anew. The silence had done its work. It had cleansed, restored, and made room for obedience born from peace, not fear. Each name, Hazael, Jehu, Elisha, sounded like a promise more than a task. Each name meant the story would continue beyond him. God was weaving his plan through generations. And Elijah was only one thread, precious, but not alone. That truth humbled him and comforted him. He no longer carried the weight of believing that he alone must save Israel. He understood now that faithfulness does not mean doing everything. It means doing what God asks, and trusting Him with the rest. He looked down the path that wound from the mountain toward the desert. It shimmered in the light, empty yet full of calling. The same road that had once felt like escape now felt like return. He could almost hear the whisper again, quieter than the wind, but stronger than fear. Go, Elijah. Walk with peace. I go before you. He smiled faintly. His cloak fluttered in the mountain breeze. It no longer felt like hiding. It felt like mantle, the covering of purpose. He turned once more to look at the cave. The place where despair had turned to revelation. It stood silent, shadowed, holy. He whispered softly, "Thank you for meeting me here." No answer came. Only the same tender quiet that had healed him. But he knew the presence was listening. He stepped forward. One step. Then another. The sound of his sandals against the rock was the first human sound the mountain had heard since dawn. It seemed almost sacred. Each step downward carried him farther from the solitude of revelation and closer to the world of men and mission. But Elijah no longer felt torn between the two. He understood that the God who spoke on the mountain would walk with him in the valleys too. His task was not to live on Horeb forever. It was to carry Horeb's peace into the noise of life. The desert below awaited him. The wilderness through which he had once wandered in fear now stretched before him as a path of obedience. And though he would travel it alone in body, he would never again walk alone in spirit. He could already see the shapes of purpose forming in the distance: the towns, the people, the kings, the young man named Elisha who would soon become both student and friend. The Lord had planned this long before the prophet's despair. Even in Elijah's running, God had been preparing renewal. That realization filled him with quiet awe. He understood now, the silence was never punishment. It was preparation. The whisper had not come to end his ministry. It had come to transform it. And in that transformation, Elijah found freedom. He no longer needed to prove God's power. only to walk in God's presence. He no longer needed to fight every battle, only to fight the right ones. He no longer needed to speak in fire, for his silence itself had become a testimony of faith. He descended further. The rocks gave way to sand. The wind carried the faint smell of earth and acacia. The world below still waited for its miracles, but the man who would bear them had changed. Faith had been renewed. Mission had been restored. And Elijah knew. The same voice that whispered in the stillness would speak again on dusty roads, in crowded cities, through quiet obedience and faithful work. Every step downward was holy, for he walked not away from God, but with him. And somewhere within, the whisper remained. Soft. Certain. I am with you. Always. The mountain receded behind him. Step by step. Stone yielding to slope. Slope giving way to sand. Elijah walked in the hush that lingers after holiness. Not to keep the moment from ending, but to let it deepen within. Each footfall felt like agreement. A quiet yes placed upon the path the whisper had opened. The sky spread wide as a promise. Pale blue fading toward the horizon where heat made the air tremble. A hawk turned slow circles above the ravine. A ribbon of wind moved low through the shrubs and carried the scent of dust and distant acacia. The same wilderness that once felt like exile now felt like a corridor of return. He moved without hurry. Obedience does not need haste when presence sets the pace. The memory of the cave rested in him like cool water held in an earthen jar. Wind. Earthquake. Fire. Then the voice that had spoken without raising its volume. He carried that order like a map for his heart. When noise rose, he would wait for the whisper. When fear shook, he would stand where peace had taught him to stand. The path bent into a shallow wadi where last rains had left a thread of moisture beneath the sand. His fingers brushed the brittle tips of grass that dared to live there. He noticed how life continued in small ways. Not by spectacle, but by persistence. Tiny prints stitched along the bank, fox, lizard, small birds, a liturgy of survival written in the margins of rock. He paused beneath a low thorn to rest in its thin shade. The cloak that once felt like hiding now settled across his shoulders like a mantle. Not weight, but belonging. He let his eyes close. Not from weariness alone, but to listen again for the gentleness that had changed everything. The whisper did not repeat itself, yet it remained. A stillness beneath thought. A companionship that did not need to be seen to be sure. He rose and continued, passing a scatter of stones that gleamed like small altars in the sun. He did not build one here. The altar he needed was already within. Formed of quiet, arranged by trust, fire kindled by mercy rather than zeal. Toward evening, the land opened into a plain where travelers sometimes crossed between villages. A small caravan moved along the far edge, merchants with soft-footed camels, a boy walking backward to watch the laden animals with more pride than caution. Elijah lifted a hand in greeting. They answered with nods that said, "Peace to your path." He did not seek conversation. Yet even the sight of people no longer struck him as threat. The heart that has been met by God can meet the world without armor. He drank from a skin and ate from the simple store he carried. Bread tasted again of the angel's kindness. Water of the God who sees. He remembered the broom tree without dread. Only with gratitude that despair had not been allowed the final word. Night gathered slowly. Stars emerged like seeds thrown generous across a dark field. He lay near a cluster of rocks that kept the wind gentle. Back on Carmel, he had once watched heaven flame. Here he watched heaven rest. Both were holy. Both belonged to the one who now kept his breathing even. At first light he rose, brushed the dust from his knees, and set his face toward the road of anointing. Hazael, Jehu, Elisha. Names like doorways he would walk through in their time. The tasks did not press him, they waited with him. Mission no longer felt like a race, it felt like a conversation stretched kindly over days. He passed a shepherd guiding ewes along a seam of green. The man lifted his staff in greeting. Elijah watched the careful way the flock answered a voice they trusted. A lesson walked beside him. Leadership shaped not by force, but by familiarity. The shepherd's call was small, and yet the whole hillside moved. He smiled at the mercy of recognition. By midday he reached a rise where the land gave him distance to see fields below, furrows drawn straight as prayer lines, oxen tugging against yokes with faithful strength, a figure sending seed from a wide, practiced hand. The image fixed within him. Calling up the parable that was not yet spoken in the world but already inscribed in heaven, kingdoms grow like seed, not like sword. He walked on. A woman at a well drew water hand over hand. She looked up with the open welcome of those who know wilderness hospitality. A dipper was offered, he received it with thanks. The water was cool, the moment ordinary, and therefore holy. The presence he carried met him as clearly at a rope-worn well as on a firelit mount. Afternoon eased toward evening again. He felt tired in the good way. The kind of weariness that follows purpose rather than panic. He considered the road still to come and found no dread waiting there. When the mind reached for fear's old script, peace took the page and wrote another sentence, "I am with you." The first rumor of cultivated land touched the air, cut straw, pressed grapes, the sweetness of fig, signs that he was nearing the places where names would become faces. A plowshare flashed in the distance. Oxen heaving in rhythm. A young man steady at the handles, patient with earth, at home with work. The sight held him for a moment. Not recognition yet, only the quiet sense that Providence was arranging its introductions. He offered a prayer without words for those he would meet. For kings whose hearts needed turning. For a nation that needed healing. For a student whose life would soon be braided with his own. The prayer sounded like breathing. rise, fall. A cadence learned on Horeb and kept on the road. Campfire smoke lifted from a small encampment tucked against a ridge. A family's simple meal, flatbread warming on a stone. Lentils giving up their fragrance to the air. Laughter small and tired and true. He felt the ache of affection for a people easily led astray and just as easily restored when kindness leads them home. Darkness settled again. He lay upon his cloak and watched constellations wheel with unhurried certainty. The same hand that steadied their courses steadied his steps. He let that confidence carry him towards sleep. The restful knowledge that tomorrow's obedience would be given tomorrow's grace. Before his eyes closed, the whisper drew near in memory, not sound now, but promise. Not instruction now, but companionship. He remembered the cave's threshold, the covered face, the tenderness that had named him beloved without using the word. He remembered that the way back to courage would always be the same path, through quiet, through listening, through trust. He slept beneath the wide mercy of the sky. The mountain stood far behind him, yet not absent. It lived within him as peace. And the road ahead, with all its meetings and makings, waited like a field already blessed with early rain. Morning would find him walking again. Not the runner fleeing a threat, but the servant keeping step with a gentle God. And each step would plant something invisible where his sandal touched earth. The calm of a life returned to its center. The witness of a heart that had learned to hear the smallest voice and follow it without fear. The road stretched long and quiet before him. Yet every mile felt lighter now. The silence that had once frightened him had become his companion. The same hush that met him on the mountain now walked beside him in the lowlands. As Elijah descended from the high places, the wind at his back whispered through his cloak. It did not roar. It sighed, as though the Spirit itself moved in rhythm with his steps. He no longer searched for thunder. He no longer waited for proof. He had seen that the greatest strength of God is not in force, but in gentleness. Each step he took carried that truth deeper into him. When he had faced kings, he had known courage born of fire. When he had faced famine, he had known faith born of desperation. But now, as he walked through quiet fields and still air, he knew peace, the kind born of trust. Gentleness, he realized, is not weakness. It is power restrained by love. He looked around him, the desert slowly giving way to green patches of growth. The first small trees, the sound of water somewhere distant. The world was alive again. The same land that had felt cursed now seemed touched by mercy. It was as if the mountain's whisper had followed him, shaping how he saw, how he listened, how he lived. He thought of how God could shake mountains, yet chose instead to steady hearts. He thought of how God could command fire, yet chose instead to speak in calm. And in that realization, he found the very heartbeat of heaven. The gentle power of God does not conquer through fear. It heals through presence. That power had found him beneath a broom tree when he wanted to die. It had found him in the wilderness when he thought he was alone. It had found him in the cave when the world felt lost. And now it found him again on the road, not as a command to act, but as companionship that walked beside him. He smiled faintly at the thought. Because he could feel it, that quiet nearness. Every sound, every movement seemed to carry its echo. A breeze passing through tall grass sounded like peace in motion. A bird's song, small and fleeting, sounded like gratitude taking flight. He realized that once, he had tried to represent God through power. Through displays, through fire, through victory. Now, he understood that to truly represent God was to mirror his gentleness. The prophet of confrontation had become the prophet of quiet conviction. He no longer needed to win hearts by fear. He would win them through faithfulness, through peace, through presence. For what is divine strength, if not the ability to remain kind in a world of noise? He remembered the moment the still small voice touched his soul. That single heartbeat of eternity when all of creation seemed to hold its breath. It had not changed the world around him. It had changed the world within him. And that change would ripple outward, in every step, every word, every act of mercy he would show to others. He thought again of the young man whose name had been given, Elisha. A student. A companion. Someone to share the journey. The whisper had spoken that name with the same quiet certainty that now filled his heart. Elijah felt something like joy, not loud or quick, but deep and still. He would teach this young man what the mountain had taught him. That God's strength is not seen most clearly when fire falls, but when peace remains. He imagined the days ahead, walking the roads, teaching the boy to listen for the unseen, to look for the holy in ordinary things. And he knew that every lesson would begin the same way. With silence. With stillness. With listening. The gentle power of God is learned not by striving, but by staying. He stopped for a moment on the path and turned his eyes toward the sky. The same blue dome that had watched him flee, that had watched him fall, that had watched him rise again. He spoke softly, not as one demanding to be heard, but as one who knew he already was. Your strength, Lord, is not the breaking of stone. It is the mending of hearts. The words floated into the breeze and were carried away. Not lost, but received. Elijah's heart filled with quiet reverence. He understood now that every prophet, every servant, every follower of God is not called to show the world how powerful heaven is, but how kind. And that kindness, that holy gentleness, is what moves mountains far greater than those made of stone. The sun leaned westward. Shadows grew long. And the road ahead curved into the soft gold of evening. Elijah continued on, not hurried, not hesitant. Simply faithful. He had nothing left to prove. Only peace to share. And the same whisper that once called him out of hiding now called him forward. Soft. Patient. Steady. For this is the gentle power of God, that he rules the universe with a voice quiet enough to rest the soul. The road grew softer beneath Elijah's feet. Not in texture, but in meaning. The dust no longer spoke of wandering. It spoke of walking with purpose. He had learned that when the heart quiets, God is never far. The silence that had once frightened him now felt like an open door. A sacred space where heaven and earth could meet without noise or effort. He walked slowly, listening, not to the sounds around him, but to the stillness within. Each breath, each step, became part of that conversation. He no longer asked, "Where are you, Lord?" For he had learned that the question was never whether God was near, but whether he himself was still enough to notice. The voice of God was not gone. It was simply gentle. It spoke in the rise of morning wind, in the rhythm of footsteps on soil, in the steady beat of his own heart. And Elijah began to understand that stillness was not the absence of movement. It was the presence of awareness. The same God who had thundered on Sinai, who had rained fire upon Carmel, who had sent angels to feed him under the broom tree, was now speaking through silence. The same voice. Different tone. He remembered how easily fear and exhaustion can drown out that whisper. How quickly the noise of duty can make one forget the sound of peace. But now, each moment felt slower, wider, more sacred. He saw God in the ordinary, in the way sunlight touched the edge of a rock, in the flight of small birds tracing invisible paths across the sky, in the laughter of shepherds calling to one another across the plain. Every small thing became a reminder that stillness is not only found in caves or mountains. It can be carried into the noise of life. And perhaps that was the truest lesson of all. To hear God, one does not always need miracles. Only space. Only attention. He thought of the kings he would soon meet, the voices of command and chaos that filled their courts. He wondered if they had ever stopped long enough to hear the whisper. He prayed silently that they might. That somehow, through his words and his calm, they too would sense that God's voice does not compete for attention, it simply waits to be heard. He smiled faintly at the thought. The quiet he carried within him had become a kind of light, not bright, but steady. It guided him when decisions felt uncertain. It reminded him when fear tried to return. The stillness itself had become prayer. He did not need to close his eyes or kneel to speak with God. Every moment of awareness was communion. Every breath a confession of trust. When he stopped to drink from a stream, the trickle of water against the stones sounded like worship. When the wind bent the grass around him, it sounded like praise. Even his own silence felt like part of that song. And he realized, this is what it means to walk with God. To live aware of his nearness, not just in holy places, but in every place. To listen not only for his words, but for his presence in the quiet between them. The stillness had become a sanctuary that traveled with him. He no longer needed to climb a mountain to find peace. The mountain now lived within his heart. and from that stillness flowed the strength to act when called. He would still speak when God required, still stand before kings, still face danger. But his spirit would no longer rise and fall with the noise of the world. It would remain anchored in the silence that speaks. He knew there would be times when fear would try to shout again, when the world's noise would press close. But he also knew the voice that had found him once in the cave would find him again, wherever he went. For once a heart has learned to hear God in stillness, it can never be deafened by noise again. He lifted his eyes toward the horizon. The day was long, the work ahead still waiting. But he felt no hurry. The God who speaks in whispers does not measure faith by speed. He measures it by stillness, by trust, by peace. Elijah breathed in the warm air, and with each breath, the whisper seemed to echo softly within him. I am here, always here, in the quiet, in the waiting, in the peace that follows every storm. He walked on, carrying the stillness like a flame that could not be blown out. And around him, creation seemed to move to the same rhythm, slow, kind, certain. The mountains behind him no longer called him back. The whisper within him now called him forward. And that was enough. The road ahead was quiet. Yet Elijah knew that silence around him did not always mean silence within. The wind had rested, the earth was still, the fire long gone. But sometimes the greater storms are the ones that rise inside the heart. He walked slowly, steady steps upon the sand, listening. Not to the world outside, but to the small stirrings within. Every soul carries its own noise. Thoughts that rush, fears that whisper, memories that echo. And Elijah knew those sounds well. He had lived through fear that shouted louder than faith, through loneliness that hummed beneath every breath, through the heavy silence that feels like absence before it reveals itself as presence. He had learned that the truest stillness is not found by escaping the world. It is found by quieting the noise that lives inside it. The mountain had taught him that lesson. But now the road was teaching him to live it. For when the voice of God is a whisper, the heart must learn to listen beyond its own restlessness. He paused by a lone tree bending under the weight of the sun. Its branches moved gently in the faint breeze. Leaves trembling, but not breaking. It reminded him of faith, not unmoving, but unshaken. Bending with wind, yet rooted in trust. He sat beneath its shade, closed his eyes, and waited. At first, thoughts rose like dust in a windless space. They spoke of the tasks ahead, the kings he must meet, the boy named Elisha, the dangers yet to come. They filled the air of his mind with questions, worries, echoes of old fear. And then, slowly, like waves receding after storm, they began to fade. In their place, there was something quieter, deeper. Peace. He breathed it in, as though the air itself carried it. Stillness is not the absence of sound, he thought. It is the choosing of what to listen to. Inside him, two voices always spoke. One from fear, one from faith. And only silence could help him tell them apart. The noise within often tells us we are alone, that everything depends upon us, that hope is fragile. But the whisper tells another story, that God is near, that His strength holds the world together, that peace is stronger than fear will ever be. Elijah opened his eyes. Before him stretched miles of wilderness, the kind of vastness that can make a man feel small. Yet for the first time, he did not feel small in a way that frightened him. He felt small in the right way, the way that lets one rest in the greatness of God. The noise of his heart had quieted, and in that stillness, the whisper became clear again. It said nothing new, yet everything changed. You are mine. The words were not heard. They were felt. Steady, sure, kind. He realized then that all along, the loudness of the world, and the louder noise of his own worry, had only ever made it hard to hear what had never stopped being true. He smiled faintly. Even in our faith, there can be noise, the need to prove, to strive, to make visible what God asks only to be trusted. But now Elijah understood. The truest form of faith is quiet, not because it has no doubts, but because it knows where to bring them. He stood again, brushed the dust from his hands, and looked toward the road. The tree above him whispered with the wind. A low, rhythmic rustle, like a hymn in another tongue. And the prophet thought, perhaps even creation carries its own quiet struggle. The same longing to be still and know. He walked on, slower now, more deliberate, letting the silence return with each step. When thoughts tried to rise again, he simply breathed, letting them pass like clouds over the wide desert sky. He knew now that to serve God was not to silence the noise by force, but to make peace with it. For stillness is not found by fighting sound. It is found by inviting peace to stay longer than fear. He remembered the cave, the place where he had first covered his face before the whisper. The memory came not as drama, but as comfort. The same peace that met him there now met him here. The same God who spoke beyond the noise of nature was speaking beyond the noise within. He felt lighter with each mile. Because when the soul learns to rest, the journey itself becomes worship. The path no longer felt long. It felt holy. And the prophet walked, heart uncluttered, thoughts unhurried, spirit calm. The whisper no longer needed to speak, because it had become the rhythm of his very being. And the noise within had become quiet. The sun hung low upon the horizon, turning the desert gold. stretching the prophet's shadow long and thin upon the sand. Each step Elijah took felt lighter than the one before. Not because the road had changed, but because his heart had. There was peace now. Not the fragile peace that depends on perfect days, but the kind that endures storms and still stands. He knew this peace because he had met its giver. Fear had followed him for so long. It had chased him from cities, from altars, from crowds. It had made him run beneath the weight of his own calling. But now, fear walked behind him, smaller than it once seemed, quiet, powerless. For fear cannot survive where perfect love dwells. And on Horeb, Elijah had met that love. Not in fire or fury, but in the whisper. He paused for a moment and looked back. The mountain was a faint outline in the distance. Silent, ancient, steady. It stood not as a memory of fear, but as a monument of faith. From there, he had learned that the peace of God is not the absence of noise, but the assurance that even in the noise, God remains unchanged. Peace had followed him down the mountain, not like a song that fades, but like a heartbeat that stays. He understood now that true peace is not found in escape, but in surrender. It is not the calm after control. It is the calm after letting go. He sat beside a small rise of stone and rested, his cloak wrapped lightly about him. The evening breeze moved softly over his shoulders. He watched the shifting colors of the sky, amber, then rose, then indigo. The day giving way to night as gently as prayer gives way to silence. And he thought, how strange it is that the same world which holds storms also holds stillness. The same God who commands the wind also speaks in whispers. And the same heart that once trembled in fear can become the resting place of peace. He smiled faintly. For the lesson was simple now. Fear imagines the future without God in it. Peace remembers that He never leaves. Every time fear had spoken, it had promised danger, isolation, failure. But peace spoke another truth. You are safe in me. You are never alone. Elijah leaned back against the stone, closed his eyes, and let that truth breathe through him. The peace of God is not an emotion. It is a presence. It is not felt only when life is gentle. It is known even when life is not. He remembered the fire of Carmel, the trembling of the people, the victory that had once felt so complete, yet so quickly undone by fear. Now he understood. That moment had shown the power of God. But this moment showed his heart. Power can move a nation, but peace can move a soul. And that is where true change begins. Within. He felt gratitude rise in him, not loud, not overflowing, but steady, quiet, sure. Gratitude that God had not answered his despair with judgment, but with gentleness. Gratitude that when he had prayed to die, heaven had sent him bread instead. Gratitude that when the world had been too loud, God had whispered. He realized then that fear could still visit him, but it could never own him again. Because once the soul has known peace, real peace, it cannot be deceived by noise. He opened his eyes again. The first star had appeared in the blue above. Small, patient, faithful. He smiled. Even the stars wait in peace, he thought. They do not hurry to shine. They simply remain. That is what he would do now. Remain. Trust. Obey. The peace beyond fear is not loud. It is steady. It stays when all else shakes. He rose slowly. The night wind met him kindly, carrying the scent of the coming dusk. He adjusted his cloak and began to walk again. The path ahead was still uncertain. The tasks still many. The world still noisy. But within him, there was quiet, deep as a well, unmoved by what surrounded it. He knew now that peace is not the end of the journey. It is the strength that carries one through it. Each step forward was a prayer of gratitude. Each breath a reminder of mercy. And as he walked beneath the first gathering of stars, Elijah whispered softly, "Even when I am afraid, I will trust. For you are peace. You are here. Always." The desert wind carried his words away, not as loss, but as offering. And heaven, in its vast silence, received them. Night had fallen completely now. The last light of day had faded into soft indigo, and the sky above stretched wide and endless, stitched with quiet stars. Elijah walked until the ground beneath his feet cooled, until the path beneath him glowed faintly in moonlight. The world had hushed itself, no voices, no movement, only the steady breath of the earth resting beneath heaven's watch. He stopped at a small rise where the desert opened like an ocean of shadow. From here, the mountain was far behind him, but its memory lived close. He could still feel the quiet of Horeb inside him. Still hear the faint echo of that still small voice that had changed everything. He sat upon the earth and drew his cloak around him. The night air was cool, brushing gently against his face. Above him, the constellations stood patient, unmoving. Old witnesses to new peace. And there, beneath the wide sky, the prophet let his spirit rest. He thought of the long road that had brought him here, from fire to fear, from despair to deliverance, from running away to being sent again. The journey had not been easy, but it had been holy. For every wilderness that humbles a heart becomes a meeting place with God. He understood now that the Lord had not come to break his strength, but to teach him how to use it gently, to show him that power without peace burns too fast. and that true strength is quiet enough to listen. The whisper had not only called him, it had changed him. He no longer saw the silence of God as distance, but as depth. The same stillness that had once frightened him now felt like home. He closed his eyes and breathed in the night. It was filled with sound, soft, distant, sacred. The sigh of the wind through low shrubs. The hum of unseen life moving carefully through the dark. The heartbeat of creation, slow and sure. And somewhere within all that, a voice. Not separate, but woven through it all. Not words this time. Only presence. He let his mind grow still. No more worries of kings or commands. No more fear of tomorrow. Only this moment. This peace. This presence that holds all things. He whispered softly, almost to himself. Thank you. For the silence that saves me. For the whisper that restores me. For the peace that carries me. His voice was quiet, and yet heaven heard. Because every sincere whisper, every gentle thank you, is a prayer. The stars above did not answer, but they shone a little brighter, as though they too worshipped in silence. Elijah leaned back against the earth and let his body rest. His heartbeat slowed. His breathing deepened. The quiet he had carried since the mountain now filled him completely. He understood that peace is not something God gives once. It is something He becomes within us. That the same voice which spoke across the centuries still speaks now, not in fire or thunder, but in stillness. In love. In the quiet moments that cradle the soul. He thought of those who would come after him, those who would also seek to hear God's voice. Those who would mistake His silence for absence. He wished they could know what he now knew. That God's quiet is not distance. It is closeness too deep for sound. He looked once more toward the horizon. The first hint of dawn touched its edge. A pale promise of another day. He smiled faintly. Peace was not something to find again tomorrow. It was already here. He let his eyes close. And as sleep began to draw near, he rested in the truth that had healed him, that God is not only in the fire that falls or the mountain that shakes. He is in the breath that steadies, the silence that holds, the stillness that speaks. The prophet's journey was not over, but the striving was. Tomorrow would bring new roads, new voices, new tasks. But tonight, only peace. The whisper that once called his name upon the mountain now lulled him toward rest. Soft, patient, eternal. And under the canopy of stars, Elijah slept in the arms of the same presence that had spoken long ago. Still gentle, still near, still God.